Thank you very much indeed, Bob, for your kind words. It is fabulous to be back here at DICE 25 years after I left as an alumni, and to see so many amazing people in the room. Some real titans of the biodiversity community have come out this evening. It's fabulous to see many of you again and to meet many of you here for the first time, or again after 25 years. So I'm going to say a few words, not so much about what I do, although it's drawn on what I've been up to, and including reflecting on that photo that Bob showed before. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to provide a various number of reflections, some of which I hope will be interesting to some of you. Almost certainly none of them will be interesting to all of you, and I'm sure none of you will be interested in everything I'm going to say. But what I hope will happen this evening is that you will be provoked a little bit, you'll have a chance to reflect on some of my reflections. It may lead to some interesting follow-up conversations this evening or going forwards, and I hope you find it interesting. If you don't, then get your money back from Bob on the way out. And I'm going to focus very much on the international space in which I've been working for these last 25 years. So I think it's important to, let me tell you when the slide advances, because for a couple of them it's going to be really important not to go ahead too quickly in those. That's fine. I hope this is interesting. It's going to focus on the international scene in which I've been working, but as we saw from Bob's presentation before, the international, national, local, incredibly connected, and of course interdependent on each other for action and progress that's going to be made. So if we go on to the next slide, and Bob spoke to some of this in terms of the terminology, the jargon that's used in the community. And my first reflection, and they will vary in how interesting and important they are. Some of them, this one you might consider to be slightly inane, but I'm going to reflect on it anyway. And it's this, that we use many different forms of terminology within the community with different audiences to describe basically the same thing. So I'm reflecting here on the biodiversity crisis. I could be reflecting on the nature crisis, or the natural capital crisis, or the wildlife crisis, or the environmental crisis, or the crisis facing life on Earth, the crisis facing fauna and flora, and this interesting recent campaign to add fungi to our scope of work and call it funga because it sits better with fauna and flora. We get hung up sometimes on these terminologies, and we shouldn't, but we should be deliberate about them. And use the terminologies that might resonate most with an audience, a sector, a community we want to engage and work with. And I'll come on to talk about some of the trends in this, because many of these have gone through various trends in use and fashions and modes of the way in which we use them. I guess the best example of that would be the ecosystem services and the nature's contributions to people. So for about 20 years now, we've been talking about ecosystem services. It's a really important way of demonstrating the connection of the environment, the natural world, life on Earth, to people. In the recent 5 or so years, we've been talking about nature's contributions to people. It means exactly the same thing, and we shouldn't be too fussy about the terminology we're using, but often we do. Another good example of that would be the rewilding, as we heard before, or the restoration, or the regeneration, or the rehabilitation, or as I often refer to it, the reimagining of ecosystems in the world in which we live. All of these basically mean the same thing, although there's a huge academic literature arguing for the differences and the nuance between them. Now, again, I encourage we don't get hung up too much on that. But on the restoration, the rewilding agenda, the most important thing there is that it's forward-looking. So we shouldn't be looking back to the past about what's been there before. We should be looking to the future about what we want to imagine the environment in which we live going forwards. On the next slide, one of the big transitions we have seen in the last, I guess, 20 years ago or so, has been a transition, and it comes across in the way in which we describe nature in the media and in the way in which international policy discourse happens, from focused on the impacts we have on nature, the problems we've been facing from pollution and from climate and from overexploitation, to the consequences of that because of our dependencies on nature. And this has really transformed the international policy discourse in the last 20 years, both in the public sector and the private sector. And so it is now well understood, and I think the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment from 20 years ago or so was groundbreaking in this narrative change, that we are dependent on the environment. We're dependent through our societies, through our economies, on the environment. About half of global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature, the services provided by nature. This is recognised in the science. We've got this burgeoning literature in the last 20 years, understanding better our dependencies on nature. It's recognised by CEOs around the world. So this, on the right here, is the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. It's a survey. They ask CEOs, what do you see as the big threats facing your business in the years ahead, 5 and 10 year horizon. I think this is the 10-year horizon. Now, if you looked at this, and they've been doing it for a number of years, if you looked at this 10 years ago, you wouldn't see anything to do with the environment on that list. Climate change was getting onto the list. But now you see here, critical change to Earth systems, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, natural resource shortages are 3 of the top 4 risks that CEOs of big companies around the world see to their businesses in the next 10 years. This has been a real transformation in understanding and, again, the way in which we describe and recognise the important connection between people and nature. And then on the next slide, I'm not going to go into the details of this. It's the conceptual framework from the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. My first job in UNEP was to get this up and running back in 2010 to 2012. Many of you will look at this and there's nothing new, nothing exciting about it. But what it really did was, again, galvanise that notion of the two-way interdependency and interactions between people and nature. So we see here at the bottom, nature. Nature provides benefits to people, nature's contributions to people, ecosystem services, that affects people's lives, provides for our needs in life. But we affect then through our actions the drivers of change, the pressures of change, which then affect the underlying nature on which we are dependent. So that cyclical nature, the relationship between people and nature, a really important part of the understanding and the action that's now needed to address the nature crisis. Across scales, through time, and with many mediating factors involved in our response to that cyclical nature of interaction. And we know quite a lot about this. So, and I'll come on to talk about the lack of knowledge not being a barrier to action. But we know a lot about the nature of the impact we have on the environment and the consequences of that for people. So this was actually the first time through the IPBES Global Assessment in 2019 that the direct pressures on nature, overexploitation, land and sea use change, climate change, invasive alien species, pollution, were quantified in terms of their importance to species. And we can see here across terrestrial, freshwater and marine realms that there's a pretty familiar pattern that comes through them. So we see in terrestrial and freshwater areas the most important driver of biodiversity loss, land use change, sea use change in the ocean. But it's not the most important driver in the ocean. The most important driver of biodiversity loss in the ocean is overexploitation from fisheries. We have a good understanding about that. We know what the pressures are. We can quantify them, and that's globally, but we can understand that at regional, national and local scales as well. So we know what the problems are in terms of the impacts facing the environment. And then we have a lot of information, growing information on the consequences of those, as I mentioned. So some of that's around what's happening to the ecosystems, half of ecosystems decline around the planet, 25% of species threatened with extinction, etc. And others around the consequences for people because of those changes, which I'll come on to shortly, possibly even in the next slide. Not in the next slide, coming up. Over the last 100 years, we've seen this great acceleration in many of these drivers of change, many of the pressures affecting biodiversity. And you can't read the details of this, but pollutants like greenhouse gases and various other pollutants on the left at the top there. The extent to which we have managed the land and the ocean, catch from fisheries, the nitrogen pollution in the coastal zone, all these different metrics. It doesn't matter where you look around the world. This massive acceleration in the drivers of change around the world, driven ultimately by the set of slides on the right. Things like consumption patterns, fertilizer use, the growth in large dams, although that's tailing off a little bit, water use around the world, extraction, and other technological factors driving our ability to extract, including, for example, in fisheries gear around the world. So this massive acceleration in the last 100 years, particularly in the last 50 years, it's not surprising we're seeing the challenges we face in the biodiversity crisis. And none of these, pretty much, are slowing down. So all of these pressures on biodiversity continuing to increase. Next slide, please. Ultimately, what's driving many of the challenges we face in the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis is the problem of overconsumption. This came out just recently, last month, the study. It is staggering that in the last 6 years, from 2016 to 2021, where data are available, we consumed the same amount of stuff, metric tons of stuff, as we did in the entire 20th century, the 100 years. Of course, there were less people, there was less production of things, but it is staggering to think that we have accelerated our consumption of stuff in the world by this level of magnitude in the last century. Completely out of control. 75% in 6 years of the century before that. This drills down just a bit more. So of those species that are threatened with extinction, again, we have a pretty good sense, based on expert opinion, about what those pressures are, what the big threats are to threatened species. And we can see here overexploitation, the largest, agricultural activity in various forms, crop farming, livestock farming, urban development, of course, increasingly an urbanized world with urban expansion, urban sprawl, invasion, disease, pollution, and others. So again, the point about this slide is not the detail, but the knowledge base which we have about those pressures, most important, affecting threatened species around the world. And on the next slide, we see the consequence of this in the extinction risk across various species groups. So if you are a cycad, then there's more than a 50% chance you are threatened with extinction. If you're a bony fish, then you're probably doing okay, but some of your friends and colleagues and cousins aren't doing so well. And it varies between those. So for well-studied taxa, groups of organisms, again, we have a pretty good understanding. And we can see, particularly in some areas, where we get to the bottom of this, amphibians on the list there, a number of plant species, corals. This is based on existing assessment of threat status. Of course, with those threats continuing to rise, affecting different groups in different ways, and particularly with climate, we're going to see these numbers shifting to the right, unfortunately. Next slide. And this means that the last one was about the threat of extinction. This one is about the rate of extinction, actual extinctions happening. And we can see here again in the last 100 years, this massive uptick in documented extinctions. Now, part of that is around the documentation getting better and we have more evidence information, but most of it is driven by that upswing in pressures, in threats. Again, amphibians coming out here top of the list in terms of the rate of extinction we're now seeing compared to the background rate through history. Next slide, please. At a global scale, we modified around 3/4 of the terrestrial surface of the planet. Around 2/3 of the ocean have been significantly affected by human activity. This is a global screening layer. So you'll look at this map and you'll find all sorts of fabulous pristine areas where it's deep red here. And likewise, in the green bits, you'll find areas heavily degraded. But at a global scale, this kind of screening map, and we produce this for businesses who are looking to satisfy their requirements for responding to International Finance Corporation, IFC standards they have to adhere to, about where they might be operating in parts of the world. And they need to pay more attention if there's likely natural vegetation. If it's already heavily degraded, there are different measures they need to put into place. But this is a screening layer. And what it shows is a very clear picture of global degradation. So I mentioned 3/4 of the terrestrial surface of the planet, highly modified by human activity. And this is widespread, with a large exception around those areas which are inhabited, managed, occupied, or otherwise governed through indigenous peoples and local communities, where on average there is much less degradation. Let me come back to that later in my talk as well. As a consequence of the decline in species, particularly species abundance, as the consequence of the degradation of ecosystems, we are seeing this degradation in the capacity of the system to provide benefits to people. So again, going back to the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, 17 of the 18 categories, there's a couple in there looked at in 2 different ways, are being degraded. And this is the life support system on which we all individually, as society and globally as a community, depend. We're seeing some increasing. We've done very well at maximising a few production outputs from nature. Energy, we've got a bit more energy out of nature. We've got a bit more food, a lot more food and fibre and feed out of nature. But by and large, for all of these services on which we depend to regulate our living conditions on this planet, they are being degraded. I promised before this talk wouldn't be too depressing, so we'll get to the uplifting bit shortly. Next slide, please. Some of you may be familiar with this groundbreaking study in 2021 by Partha Dasgupta. It was commissioned by the UK Treasury to look at the connection between nature and the economy. And the conclusion from that was very clear, that we've done a great job, again, in the last 30 years or so, of increasing our human capital, our produced capital, the doubling in produced capital, the stuff we produce around. This is a global study. around the world, but that's come at cost to the natural capital, biodiversity, life on Earth, environment, of around a 40% reduction in that same period of time. And the two are not just correlated, but there's a causal relationship between them. Next slide, please. I've mentioned this IPBES panel a few times. If you're not familiar with it, I do encourage you to take a look. And what it does is bring together the body of evidence and knowledge in relation to particular issues. So there's various thematic assessments which have been done here. I've mentioned the global assessment as well in 2019. I do encourage you, if you're not familiar with that, to take a look at the findings of IPBES. And the reason they're particularly important is because they set the international benchmark standard for knowledge base on which international policy is then developed further. So they are governmentally approved scientific outputs, and that gives them a certain standing within the intergovernmental process, which I'll come back to. Next slide, please. You've seen that photo before. That was the so-called COP15, where the Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted, the Plan for Nature, the Roadmap to Save Life on Earth. Just in the last few weeks, COP16 happened in Colombia. This was a follow-up. It was the first UN Biodiversity Conference since the adoption of the Global Plan. The ambition was to take stock of progress, but that's tricky 2 years after adopting a global plan because governments take time to take it on board at the national level. So that's very much work in progress. But I'm going to want to reflect a couple of bits on what's going on in this international biodiversity policy space, building on actually some of the things Bob spoke about before. So next slide, please. Just very quickly to outline what's in this global plan for nature, the Kunming to Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And the scope of it is broad. So there are 4 ambitious goals for 2050. And they relate to the state of nature, to put it on a path to recovery in the short term and ensure it's fully recovered by 2050. They relate to ensuring sustainable use of nature to benefit people. They relate to benefit sharing. I'll come back to that as well. It's important but often forgotten. And they relate to the means of implementation, finance on the table to help drive the changes that are needed. And then in the next slide, it shows the 23 targets which were adopted for 2030. These are global targets. They are all super ambitious for 2030. It's highly likely that most of them won't be met. We've never met an international biodiversity target at all, ever, in its entirety. There's no reason why we suddenly make a huge amount of progress in all of these, but it's important that they're there because it helps drive the direction, drive the action, drive the commitment, and drive the ambition at the national and local level as well. And they cover all sorts of different things. So the spatial planning, the restoration, Target 3 is the one that Bob spoke to before, referred to as the 30 by 30. I'll come back to that too. And many others, including mainstreaming nature into all sorts of agendas. So Target 14 here, ensuring that governments take nature on board, not just in the nature department, in the DEFRAs and the park services, but across the entirety of government. Businesses, and I'll come back to that too, the important role of business in understanding, assessing, disclosing and acting on their findings in relation to their dependencies and impacts on nature. Sustainable consumption, finance, many others. The important point about this is when we think about the international ambitions for nature, we need to think about this broader configuration of targets. Next slide, please. 30 by 30. Bob's mentioned this already. When you mention 30 by 30 in an audience of conservationists, they immediately think, as we referred to earlier, to protected areas. But if we press the button again, I'm going to explain why there are 3 30 by 30s, and all of them are super important if we make progress on the biodiversity crisis. So the first of these we'll go very quickly onto is the one you've seen the words of already. That's fine. That's the second. The point about this is if you get 196 governments in a room to negotiate text, it's never going to read well. And if you put this stuff through a readability score, it by all intents and purposes, it's illegible to almost all people, and probably including to most people who negotiated it. So there are 196 versions of the interpretation of what all this stuff means. But a critical thing here for Target 3 is that there are 12 different elements in there that all come together in what's needed to achieve Target 3. So it's not just the expansion in coverage, the more dimension. It's the better stuff in there too, in terms of where the protected areas are, conserved areas are, how well they are connected, how effectively they are managed. If we go on to the next slide. As Bob mentioned, both protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, OECMs, are going to be important in making progress towards this international ambition. They're both hugely important. The chances are we're going to make a huge amount of progress on coverage towards the 30% ambition simply by accounting for existing OECMs, so recognising areas of land as OECMs with zero conservation additionality whatsoever, because their existing management is such they're providing benefits for nature. So we'll account for those existing areas, the numbers will shoot up and probably get to somewhere in the upper 20s simply by accounting for existing areas, again with no conservation additionality, but we'll make great progress on the coverage. So what's going to be important, that's on land, not so much in the ocean, but what's going to be important then is working on these other parts of the target to make sure they are well managed, they are well connected, they're in the right places for nature, equitably governed, and other dimensions of the target. Next slide, please. This is the global map, the latest, not quite the latest, about 8.4% in the ocean now and 7.3% on land. But this is the state of the world in relation to protected areas and OECMs. 9 countries and territories have now reported on OECMs. That number is growing, the UK have not yet. And that's added about 1% in terms of global coverage on land already, just with 9 countries and territories. These protected and conserved areas are in all sorts of interesting places, but they're still 1/3 of the most important sites for biodiversity around the world, as measured by so-called key biodiversity areas, which have no protection whatsoever. Only about 8% of these protected areas are well connected to one another, so big gaps in the connectivity dimension of the target as well. And in the marine area, only about just under 2% of that is in the high seas, most of it's in coastal areas, so massive gaps in high seas protection, which the recent agreement on a high seas treaty on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction will help to address in due course, we hope. So a mixed picture, but lots of good progress that's been made, but we are miles off the 30% ambition. So there's another 16 or so million square kilometres needed on land and about 78 million square kilometres of the ocean needed just to meet the coverage dimension of the 30 by 30 protected areas target. Only about 5% of the existing areas we have any idea whether they have any management plans or not, let alone their effectiveness. So we're miles off understanding and delivering on effective protected and conserved areas. But the numbers will start to shoot up as we identify more OECMs. Next slide, please. About 13% of indigenous and traditional territories around the world fall outside of existing protected and conserved areas, and yet are super important for the conservation of nature and sustainable use of nature. So recognising these areas is going to be important alongside the protected and conserved area estate as well. Another 30 by 30 is target 2, where there's a commitment to restore 30% of degraded areas by 2030 as well. We have got to the stage, as we saw from many earlier slides, about the need to invest in restoration, rewilding, whatever we want to call it. Super important. But there's a big question about what this means in practice in the next slide. So we've got parts of the world which are pristine, beautiful forest in the top left. We've got parts of the world where that's been degraded, natural areas that are degraded. We've got parts of the world which are extremely effective in producing food, top right there. We've got areas of the world where which have been converted but are themselves then degraded agricultural lands. So if you ask 196 governments what they agreed to in 2022 in terms of the restoration target, you all get different answers to this. At a global level, it's clear we need to restore degraded areas of natural land. It's clear there are many areas of under food production which would be better served as nature areas, providing benefits from nature beyond food production. And it's also clear we need to restore degraded areas of food production in order to produce more food, be more efficient and effective in producing food. So all of that's critically important. 30% of what is anyone's guess at the global level, but it's probably not important because all of these global targets only really have meaning when they are being delivered at the national and local scale. So the question isn't which part of the 30% of the planet should be restoring, it's in the UK, in Kent, in East Kent, which are the areas which are most important to restore in order to deliver the benefits, to reimagine that future you want. And it may well be more intensive food production to take pressure off other areas you want to restore back to natural ecosystems. So prioritising at the national and local level, critically important in delivering the global ambitions on restoration. Next slide, please. And then the third 30 by 30 is this ambition here on finance. So in a context of a wider ambition for generating $200 billion a year of finance for nature by 2030, there's an ambition to deliver on $30 billion of public international finance ODA, international public finance, by 2030 as well. This often flies under the radar, but actually politically and in practice is probably one of the most important targets amongst the 23 we have there. I should point out that the 200 billion a year by 2030 is from all sources. We spend about 100 billion a year on ice cream around the world. So whilst 200 billion sounds like a lot of money, it's actually not very much in the scheme of things. The overall biodiversity finance gap is about 700 billion a year, 500 billion from perverse subsidies, 200 billion in finance needed. They need to come together to move and transition away from those perverse subsidies to increase the amount of cash available to close that finance gap. But a key part of that is the 30 billion by 2030 of international public finance. And in the next slide, we'll see progress being made there. It's very, very limited. Again, it's a bit tricky to know what counts. This is the OECD financial reporting. If you look at the biodiversity specific values, we're up at about 14 or 15 billion a year now, the lower graph. If you look at the top one, biodiversity related, this might include a road that's been invested in somewhere in the world, and if you put some wildlife corridors in, the entire budget of the road would fit into this top biodiversity related tracker. Probably that wouldn't count in most people's eyes, but it's here on the graph. So we're making some progress, but we've got a lot more to do to make sure the finance is in place to deliver across the rest of the targets. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, an example from Uganda. Uganda has just over 15% protected area coverage in Uganda. It's an important country for biodiversity internationally, globally. If Uganda were to take on the 30% global target at the national level, that would result in them doubling their coverage of protected areas. They struggle at the moment in Uganda to manage the existing protected area network because of a lack of investment. There's encroachment, there's ineffective management. A lot more money is needed in Uganda right now to manage the 15%, just over 15% in an effective way. If that's going to double to 30%, it's going to create more than a doubling of requirement for financial resources to deliver an effective conservation network in Uganda, because it would create additional pressures. It would take. So the context for an increase in coverage of protected areas needs to be seen in the context of financial resources, capacities, and other parts of the global biodiversity framework. Uganda is party to the CBD, but also to many other international environmental conventions. Not got time to go through all of these, but the point is that when you are a country looking to respond to the international commitments you've made, you're looking to address many of them, and sometimes they come together neatly at the national level. The restoration agenda on the climate agenda, land degradation and biodiversity, for example. Sometimes they are competing for resources. Next slide, please. Right. I want to just very quickly talk about something which is really, really important, but possibly no one's ever heard of, and I'm conscious of the time as well. Anyone hazard a guess what the next word is on this slide? Don't press it yet. There's a clue, isn't there, in the picture here? Kind of. Let's press it and go. DSI. Anyone heard of DSI? Brilliant. So this is, as it says there in the slide, probably the most important development in international biodiversity policy, and certainly in recent years, it is by a mile the most important development in international biodiversity policy. And yet it's flown completely under the radar of the mainstream conservation community. So what this is digital sequencing information on genetic resources. And what this is a mechanism that was agreed back in 2022 at the COP15. It was operationalized in Cali in the last month or so. It's a mechanism by which if you generate profits from the use of genetic resources, which you've taken from an international public database somewhere, then you need to pay into a fund for the conservation of nature. If you are in a pharmaceutical sector, a cosmetic sector, a nutraceutical centre, health and if you are in food technology, ag technology, biotechnology, and increasingly information technology, information data storage, and you are dependent on DSI, then you will be invited to pay, it's a voluntary mechanism, you'll be invited to pay 1% of your profits or 0.1% of your revenue into a global fund. This could generate tens, potentially hundreds of billions of dollars a year for nature. Super, super important. Half of it's been agreed to go to indigenous peoples and local communities. who are the custodians of so much. There's a whole bunch of work to be done to operationalise this further, but it was agreed to set up 2 years ago, and last month it was agreed to operationalise it. The fund will now be set up, the mechanism will be put in place. At the national level, governments will enact the legislation and the other incentives to ensure that companies are paying into this. Keep an eye on DSI. Next slide, please. I won't go into this because of time, but business has a key role to play in understanding, disclosing and acting on their impacts and dependencies on nature. Next slide, please. Very quickly, so amongst all of these thoughts, why aren't we making progress? Why is progress so slow? Why are we still failing to address the biodiversity crisis? And let me suggest that it's nothing to do with a lack of knowledge. We need more knowledge at all sorts of scales, but lack of knowledge is not a barrier to better decision making. We have pretty good policies in place. There's some incoherence, we need to address some bits around the edges, but by and large policies are in place to encourage better decision making for nature. We're failing to act for very many reasons, which we'll go on to. But let me give you an example of that. Next slide, please. Food systems are the #1 driver of biodiversity loss around the world. On land through habitat conversion, in the ocean through fisheries. About half of habitable land has been converted for agriculture. About 3/4 of that is to produce meat and dairy. On fishery in the ocean, it's fisheries, as we mentioned already. About 1/3 of fishery stocks around the world are fished beyond sustainable limits. And yet with that knowledge that most people have, and the recognition that the most important thing that most people in most parts of this part of the world can do for biodiversity loss is dietary choice. I won't ask a show of hands, but ask yourself, is your diet plant-based? Next slide, please. The global ambition is to reverse the trends in biodiversity loss, to bend the curve of biodiversity loss, to result in a nature-positive world. And there's hugely ambitious efforts from civil society and many others promoting this. By 2030. We can bend the curve. We can't bend the curve of biodiversity loss by 2030. There's too much inertia in the system. The lag time from the effective drivers on the state of biodiversity is too great. There is too much pressure going on. We're still eating too much meat around the world. We can't deliver on this global ambition. And yet we have to try, because as we've seen from the earlier slides, not just our lives, but that of our children, our societies and our economies are dependent on the nature which we are degrading. So this remains the ambition. The Global Biodiversity Framework sets the roadmap for that, the 2030 ambitions, the 2050 outcomes to deliver on this goal. But it's going to require everyone within and beyond the community making efforts to deliver on this. Next 2 slides, I think, just to get to the last one. Just quickly on that one. Just some hope. So the great conservation success stories out there. So the bald eagle back from the brink of extinction, the humpback whale in the South Atlantic boomed back from less than 500 individuals to 25,000 because of the actions of the International Whaling Commission. But we're doing a great job of reconnecting river systems around the world, tearing down dams that have disconnected our rivers. The Brazilian Amazon, for much of the last 20 years, has been very successful in addressing deforestation with policies, legislation, enforcement, giving rights to indigenous peoples and local communities. So lots of conservation success stories on the ground. These need to be enabled further. The climate, I'm not going to talk to this, but the climate challenge is one which is growing and we're going to need to address more in the future. The latest emissions gap report that UNEP put out earlier this last month, next press, and again after that, shows that, and again after that, apologies, we're currently on set for over 3 degree rise in temperatures. Even if all existing commitments are met, including the latest announcement from the UK government, we get in the 2-point-something%. But this graphic here shows the impacts of a 2 degrees rise on people's lives in the southern Europe, northern Mediterranean, varying from unbearable to unlivable for people and for nature, with a 2 degrees rise. And we're facing much greater than that at the moment. All efforts need to be made to address the climate crisis if we're not to exacerbate the biodiversity crisis. Let me leave you with this slide here, which is so what needs to be done at this stage. Yes, we need to continue our conservation action at all scales. That's imperative. We need to deliver at more, bigger, better, whatever the terms ended up being in that wonderful. All of that needs to be done across the range of actions on finance, on protected conserved areas, on the restoration agenda, on addressing the threats to species. That needs to be done not just by a conservation community, because we can't deliver this ourselves. It needs to be done across the whole of government, all of society. All of our friends and family have to be a part of this agenda. Nature is everyone's business. All of that needs to happen at the same time as tackling the two big systemic underlying challenges we face, these underlying drivers of change. Unless we tackle these two big underlying drivers of change, then all these other actions are going to be roughshod by what's going on because of our unsustainable consumption and production patterns, and because of our financial flows, which are by 2 orders of magnitude more negative for nature than they are positive. So we have to transform our financial systems. Ask yourself, where is your pension invested? We have to transform our sustainable consumption and production patterns. Ask yourself what your diet is. Ask yourself what you're buying at Christmas time. And unless we do that systemically, then we're not going to address the biodiversity crisis. There is hope, but only if we act urgently and at scale. Thank you very much.